She is stripped naked and dragged across sharp stones, while her children, handed rocks by the crowd, are told to smash their mother's face. One accusation was enough. Then comes the ritual, performed on her naked, bleeding body, so grotesque the officiating priests vomit on the spot. Thousands of women suffered this exact sequence. Modern experts still call it the gold standard of breaking a human mind. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the real documents, the actual laws, and the horrifying testimonies that reveal a system of punishment so calculated, so theatrical, and so brutal that it makes modern horror films look tame. And here's what will really disturb you. The people who designed these punishments weren't sadistic monsters. They were respected community leaders, priests, and lawmakers who believed they were doing God's work. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you'll understand why one historian called this the most systematic destruction of the female body in European history. And fair warning, some of what you're about to hear crosses lines you didn't know existed. Before we dive into the specific punishments, you need to understand something crucial. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was never truly hers. The moment she married, she became what legal scholars called femic, a covered woman. She was covered by her husband's identity, his property, and his legal standing, and like any piece of property, damage to it was a crime against the owner, not against her person. An adulteress wasn't just breaking a marriage vow. She was committing economic and social treason. She was theft. She was counterfeiting heirs. She was destroying a man's most valuable asset, his certainty about his bloodline. Think about the economics of this for a second. In a world without DNA tests, without birth certificates, the only way a man could be absolutely sure his children were actually his was through the absolute total sexual control of his wife. Her infidelity didn't just wound his pride, it threatened to redirect his entire fortune, his land, his titles, and his name to another man's bloodline. It could destroy alliances between powerful families. It could invalidate treaties between kingdoms. The threat, in their minds, was existential. So, the response had to be proportional to this perceived existential threat. And that's where it gets dark, because these punishments weren't designed just to hurt one woman. They were designed to terrify thousands. And here's the part that should disturb you most. The communities that carried out these punishments weren't filled with evil people. They were filled with ordinary people, your bakers, your tanners, your farmers, who had been conditioned to believe that this level of violence against women was not just acceptable, but righteous, necessary, and holy. Let's start with the punishment that was considered merciful. They called it the carting or the penance walk. But those gentle terms hide something far more sinister. This was psychological warfare disguised as justice. The first weapon in this war was the shaving. Imagine you're a woman in a 14th century German town. Before dawn, the bailiff and his men break into your home. They make sure your children watch as they drag you to the town square where a rough wooden stool has been set up. A barber approaches with shears. Historical records from Augsburg describe how they would deliberately make the shaving as ugly as possible. They'd leave patches, cut the scalp, or use dull shears to make the woman look not just shaved, but diseased, monstrous. One account from 1487 describes a woman who begged them to at least make it even, and the crowd laughed. Her humiliation was their entertainment, but the shaving served a deeper, symbolic purpose. In medieval symbolism, a woman's long hair was her crown, her beauty, her feminine identity. For a married woman, her bound or covered hair was a symbol of her modesty and her marital status. To shave it was to unmake her as a woman, to strip away not just her hair, but her social identity. Then came the stripping. In some regions, they'd leave her in a thin shift, basically a nightgown. In others, particularly in England and parts of France, the law explicitly required complete nudity. Why? Because female nudity in public wasn't just shameful, it was spiritually contaminating. It transformed her into a walking curse, something that polluted the very air around her. Now here's where the psychological torture really begins. She's not just paraded through any streets. She's marched past her own house, past the church where she was married, past the market where she bought food, past the homes of people she's known since childhood. And at each stop, the crowd grows. But here's the truly diabolical part. Participation wasn't optional. Town records from multiple cities show that citizens could be fined for refusing to witness these processions. Your neighbors, your friends, people you'd shared meals with, were legally compelled to be there. And many went further than mere witnessing. Court documents describe how crowds would throw not just rotten vegetables, but stones, mud mixed with human waste, or dead animals. A record from Tuscany in 1342 describes a woman who lost an eye when someone threw a sharp bone. The authorities didn't intervene. This was working as intended. The punishment could last hours, often taking the longest possible route. Then came the final cruelty, the return home. She'd be released at her own doorstep, where she'd often find that her husband had already locked her out. Her children had been told not to speak to her. This was social death by design, and it was considered the lenient option. If this calculated destruction of a person's life and identity disturbs you, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps this history reach more people who need to understand it. To the people of medieval Europe, this wasn't barbarism. This was the ultimate form of justice. They genuinely believed that God would intervene to save the innocent and condemn the guilty, which makes what actually happened even more horrifying. The most common ordeal for accused adulteresses was the trial by cold water. The theology behind it was a twisted genius. Since water was used in baptism to welcome people into God's grace, it would naturally reject a sinner. Pure water would not accept impure flesh. Based on detailed records from dozens of trials across England, France, and Germany, the woman would be brought to a river or pond at dawn. The entire village would be required to attend, again, compulsory witnessing. The woman would be stripped to her shift, and then, as documented in legal codes like the Saxon Spiegel, she would be bound in a specific way, her right thumb tied to her left big toe and her left thumb tied to her right big toe, curling her body into a position that made swimming impossible. She would be thrown into the water. Here's the horrifying physics of it. If she floated, she was guilty, rejected by God's holy water. She'd be pulled out and immediately executed, sometimes right there at the water's edge. If she sank, she was innocent, accepted by the water. But a bound woman sinking can't swim, can't breathe. The records show officials often waited minutes. A specific case from 1194 in England notes that a woman named Edgith sank like a stone, was pulled out nearly drowned, declared innocent, but died 3 days later from brain damage due to oxygen deprivation. Think about the psychological torture. Your fate is decided by physics and fear. Either outcome could kill you, and you are forced to believe God is watching and judging. If you sink and drown, did God abandon you? If you float and are executed, did God condemn you? Trial by cold water wasn't the only ordeal. There was also the trial by hot iron. The accused had to carry a piece of red-hot iron for 9 paces. Her hands would be bandaged and after 3 days, the bandages would be removed. If the burns were healing cleanly, she was innocent. If they showed signs of infection, which was almost inevitable given medieval hygiene, she was guilty and executed. A record from the 12th century Bavaria details a woman who chose the iron over confessing to adultery, leading to such severe infection that her hands were amputated. She died from sepsis a week later, declared guilty based on the infection, and denied a Christian burial. These ordeals were eventually banned by the Catholic Church in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, but not because they were cruel. They were banned because the Church decided that making God perform miracles on command was theologically inappropriate. The suffering of the women was not the concern. The propriety of the ritual was. But even as terrible as these punishments were, the next one was designed to ensure something worse: that you'd survive, but wish you hadn't. If you wanted to understand the medieval mind, you have to understand their obsession with permanent markers. Marking someone's body was the ultimate form of record-keeping in a non-literate world. And for adulteresses, the marking was designed to be unmistakable. The laws are shockingly explicit. The laws of King Canute, which governed England and parts of Scandinavia, state clearly, "An adulteress shall have her nose and ears cut off." It doesn't say may, it says shall as the standard punishment. Here's what this meant, based on court records. The woman was brought to a public square, tied to a post, or held down. Her screams were part of the spectacle. A blacksmith or barber, the people with the sharpest blades, performed the cutting. No anesthetic. The nose would be cut off first, not just the tip, but often back to the bone of the face. The woman would often choke on her own tremendous blood loss, sometimes held face down to prevent it. Her ears would be cut next, followed by cauterization with hot iron to stop the bleeding. The smell of burning flesh would fill the square. Here's a specific case from 1231 in a German town. A woman named Gertrude was accused of adultery based on her husband's suspicion and the testimony of one neighbor. She denied it, but was convicted. Gertrude's nose and ears were cut off. The Chronicle mentions, almost as an aside, that her 3 children under the age of 7 watched the mutilation. Gertrude survived, but her husband divorced her. Her mutilated face made her unemployable, and within 6 months, the same Chronicle reports she was found dead in a ditch outside town, having likely starved. Every mutilated woman became a walking warning, a piece of living propaganda that said, "This is what happens to women who betray their husbands." Her punishment followed her everywhere until death. Town account books show payments made to the executioner or barber who performed these acts, often itemized: 3 shillings for a nose, 2 shillings per ear. There was a price list for destroying women's faces. Mutilation was for common women. For noble women, the medieval legal system had devised something arguably worse: a punishment that would destroy you slowly, in darkness and silence, over years or decades, perpetual enclosure. The most famous example is the Tour de Nesle affair of 1314. Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, married to the future kings of France, were accused of infidelity. Their male lovers were brutally executed. For Margaret and Blanche, death would have been mercy. They were sentenced to life imprisonment in separate fortress chambers. Margaret was locked in the Chateau Gaillard. The room was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, thick stone walls, 1 narrow window too high to reach. The door was sealed, leaving only a small opening for food to be passed through once a day. She was allowed no visitors, no news, and nothing to mark the passage of time except the change of light from that single window. She died in her cell after 8 years at age 30. Modern historians suspect either suicide or the psychological and physical toll of isolation. For noble and merchant-class women across Europe, the reality could be far worse: immurement or being walled up alive. Though rare, this practice is documented. A woman would be placed in a small cell, and the entrance would be bricked up, leaving only a small opening for food. She would live out her remaining days in this tomb. In 1357, a woman in Barcelona named Maria was convicted and sentenced to immurement in a cell built into the city wall. The cell was so small, she couldn't lie down fully. She lived in this space for 9 years. When they finally opened the cell to remove her body, they found she'd scratched prayers and curses into the stone walls, with her fingernails worn down to bloody stumps. Solitary confinement for more than 15 days is now considered torture by human rights organizations. These women endured years, sometimes decades, and the cruelest part? This was framed as merciful, giving the woman time to repent and reconcile herself with God. Her suffering was reframed as spiritual purification. The madness that ensued was simply seen as God's punishment. The silencing was deliberate. Their names were struck from family records. They became non-persons, erased. All of this, a system that brings us to the final, most enraging truth about medieval justice. What was happening to the men they allegedly committed adultery with? The answer will make your blood boil. In most cases, a fine. Sometimes banishment for a period. In rare cases, public penance, like wearing a sign or making a donation to the church. That's it. The double standard wasn't subtle, it was explicitly written into law. The Saxon Spiegel states that a man's adultery only counted if he was sleeping with another man's wife. If he was unmarried, or if the woman was unmarried, it wasn't legally adultery for him, it was just fornication, a minor sin requiring confession. For women, any sexual contact outside marriage was adultery, full stop. The crime wasn't about the act. It was about the property violation. Even in the rare cases where men were punished equally, there was always an out. Nobility could pay fines. Men could invoke their right to trial by combat, fighting their accuser, something women were forbidden from doing. Wealthy men could hire substitutes to fight for them. The entire system was designed with escape routes for men that women couldn't access. The men who sat in judgment on adulteresses, who threw stones, who blessed the drowning water. Statistically, many of them had committed adultery themselves. The hypocrisy was the system, the cruelty was the point, and the message was clear. Women's bodies were not their own. Women's sexuality was a resource to be controlled, regulated and punished when it strayed from male ownership. These were systematic, legalized, and performed with the full support of religious and secular authorities across Europe for centuries. If this journey through history has opened your eyes to the systematic destruction of women's rights, please do 2 things. Drop a comment telling me which specific punishment shocked you the most. Was it the carting, the drowning, or the immurement? Subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Because understanding how societies have controlled, punished, and destroyed women throughout history isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing patterns that still echo today. We have more uncomfortable truths to uncover together.